Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Analyst Bar with myself, Colin Sisson, and my co-host, Richard Agando. First of all, I wanted to start off by saying thanks ever so much for all the love, all the comments, all the supports that we've received either via our YouTube channel, some fantastic numbers on terms of subscription, but also the comments that we've had on our own individual kind of Twitter pages as well. It's been fantastic to see the buy-in, not just from Notts fans as well, from fans all over the UK and from around the world as well, who were posting comments and suggestions. So we really want to make sure that you get involved on this one as well. How have you found it, Rich?
Oh yeah, it's been amazing. The feedback that we've had has been really positive, which is great. I think we had a landmark moment, didn't we, on the second episode? We managed to get a thumbs down. So yay!
It feels good. It feels good. It feels like we're a genuine. We're genuine YouTubers now.
Exactly. We've made it to episode 3. Who'd have thought it? Eh?
Absolutely. I feel like I should clarify my current surroundings as well. So we talked in episode 2 about Ian Birchnell's need for flexibility and fluidity, and here I am having to change shape and tactics in my garage as well. So
you've been condemned to the garage.
I have. Yeah, it's not because of the thumbs down. It's not a punishment. But no, like I say, and I was considering kind of, with all the bookcases on lockdown on the news and stuff, where they've organised them quite carefully and stuff. I don't think there's anything hidden suspiciously in the bookcase or whatever, but I'm going to deny all knowledge if anyone finds anything. So that's where I am for this episode. Who knows where I'll be for the next episode? It might.
We'll wait with bated breath. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I will be quizzing you afterwards about your Subbuteo collection as well, Colin. So
I'd expect nothing less.
Okay, so let's have a look back at episode 2 then. Obviously, we discussed quite a bit around the central midfield and what have you then. Any more reflections on that at all, Colin?
Well, first of all, a shout out to Ben Fox, who I'm hoping is watching this because he actually liked my comment.
Yeah.
I tagged him in the hope that he would watch it. He might have just liked it purely out of politeness, really. But I'm going to keep pestering him until he's in the black and white shirt of Notts now.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I hope he's watching this episode as well. But no, I think it's just been nice to have the supporter buy-in as much as our own kind of conversations around those sort of players, really, and around the midfield and stuff. So, again, thank you for those people who've thrown some names out there. So Pythagorean on Twitter, who's messaged me a few names and stuff who we're going to sort of talk a little bit about in terms of some of those suggestions, but also keep your eye out on those retain lists. I gave you a little window into my world in terms of searching Twitter for words like retain list, and we're starting to have championship clubs, particularly championship clubs whose should we say that their destiny has been solved for them now that they've missed out on playoffs or relegation's been decided. They're starting to come out now, as well as big clubs announcing sort of under 23s as separate retain lists, which I think are quite interesting to look at as well. So yeah, that's my reflections really. How about you, Rich? How do you feel?
No, definitely. I thought I really enjoyed doing that last episode, actually. It was quite a long one, but I think there was plenty of content in there, and it was from our point of view, we obviously enjoyed it because we're back again. But it's the thing, like you mentioned before, about football and it being fluid and everything. What we're talking about and what we're doing is fluid, and things will continue to develop and change as we carry on. And one of the great things about what we're doing is when we're highlighting players and some of the viewers are highlighting players as well, we'll be able to keep an eye on those next season and the season after, and we'll be looking back and seeing how they have developed and how they have got on, which is a really good, thing for us. I mean, there was another one, I think we had a message from Adele Pikett, mentioned in that midfield sort of role, Sonny Carey at Kings Lynn, which I thought was a really good shout. I mean, he scored that absolute wonder goal against us at Meadow Lane. And I had a little dig into his stats, and he's quite a flexible lad. He's been playing not just midfield but out on the wing, but also at fullback as well. So that was a really good shout out. Pythagorean, as you mentioned, he brought up Boateng, who's been on loan at Exeter from NK Dons. So that was a good one, and we've all seen now as well Jack Bridge at Bromley. who had another half decent game against us at the weekend. So yeah, thanks for those shout out, guys. It was it's great that you're getting involved and bringing these names up, and certainly keeps us busy anyway.
Yeah, like I say, we're looking forward to kind of tracking some of the names. I'm going to throw a few names out there on today's episode as well. So, you know, we don't have any kind of high aspirations in terms of that not so going to be acting on any of the advice that we're suggesting. But, you know, it'd be interesting just to be able to track these players, be able to see where they go to, what their stats look like next season, for example. So, yeah, you know, keep them coming. We're keeping a list of them as well, and we want to be able to, you know, share them and kind of almost do a bit of a review episode at some point where we can go back over these players and start to think about who's made it, who hasn't quite made the grade, or maybe who do we need to be looking at perhaps next season. Who knows what next season brings.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I suppose the other thing is as well, we might even be in a position before the next season starts to have put together our own virtual squad. So we've done midfield, and yeah, we're gonna have quite a few names, aren't we? So it's going to be really interesting. But like you say, it's going to be even more interesting just seeing how they develop over time. So moving on then to this episode, yeah, we're talking about target men and really the evolution of the target man as well, Colin.
Yeah, definitely so. I mean, one of the things as a fan, and I'm sure a lot of Notts fans, but I'm sure this is probably a familiar frustration that other fans have felt as well, is that I think one position that's always been had a spotlight on it is the striker role. And I think particularly target men at Meadow Lane. I mean, I think about growing up as a Notts supporter and seeing players like Gary Lund, for example, playing that role fantastically well. You know, perfectly supported as well by Andy Legg's throw-ins and those sort of things. You know, Devon White, you know, that sort of role, and Jason Lee as well, who I think performed the role fantastically well. But then, not that I want to name and shame, but we've had quite a few players who haven't quite hit those heights as well. And so I've always been interested about what makes that role successful, particularly when we've recruited players who have been successful in previously at other clubs or have left us and gone on particularly well to do particularly well somewhere else. So yeah, I think it's quite an interesting role to get our teeth into, and then to later on talk about the current performer in that role, Kyle Wootton, and what we can find out about him stats wise.
No, absolutely. I think when we think of a target man, you know, you mentioned a few names there. We do like from certainly going back to our childhoods and things like that. I mean, I was starting to watch Notts at the time that Les Brad was around, you know, and he was a typical big centre forward, you know, classed as a target man. And, you know, some that are, when you think about it, you know, another one for me at Everton, 80s, Duncan Ferguson. I'd never seen anybody head a ball like Duncan Ferguson used to head a ball. But I think it was this traditional kind of very battling 4-4-2 with two fast wingers and two centre midfielders that were as hard as nails, and then you'd have that typical big man up front with a slightly smaller man at his side or whatever, wouldn't you? And it was all about the long ball. And you know, when you look back on those days, when you consider the condition of the pitches and everything else as well, you can understand in some respects how that became so popular in the English game. But the really interesting thing that I found looking back at this, and you shared an article with me earlier, Colin, which I found really insightful, was the fact that over on the continent, and obviously over in South America and what have you, a lot more modern game was starting to be played. The ball's obviously played on the ball a lot more. Yet in England, for years and years and decades, it's always been, it's got to be 4-4-2 with that big guy up front, you know. And even when things were changing elsewhere, we were still 4-4-2, you know. I'm not sure there's a Sunday morning team anywhere. I know when I was playing, all right, I'm going back to the 80s again, but, you know, you were just, you had 11 positions on that pitch, and you always knew what they were because it was always a 4-4-2, and that was that, and it was nothing complicated or anything. and it used to work. And the piece that you mentioned to me that I read, something that made me smile as well, was that it's only in England where we get, or in the UK, where we all get really excited about a corner. Because we're expecting some great big lump at the back post to get up there and either head it in or head it back across, you know, and that's really not happening anymore. Yet we still continue to get excited about stuff like that. And I suppose it's like I say, it's all about that traditional 4-4-2. And I'm just going to drop a slide up here if that's okay, Colin. This is something that everybody watching will be familiar with. Standard 4-4-2. But there was quite a lot of analysis and study went into the target man role, going right back to just after the war, sort of 1950. And I'm trying to remember, Colin, what the guy's name was. Was it
Charles Reap?
Charles Reap, that's right. Who after studying for years and years and years the game and analysing the game, suddenly identified that most goals were scored with the fewest amount of passes possible. And if you can get into an area of danger with your target man within 3 passes, you're really increasing your chances of getting a goal. And he called this a position of maximum opportunity, which on the little slide there you can see there's a couple of blue areas, which is the 2 posts on the goal post there, and the whole idea was that within, you know, you would get these long balls lumped up to your top man there, your target man, and he's either going to bring it down and have an opportunity himself, or he's going to lay it off for his number 10. And it's quite interesting how the English game and the British game kind of stuck with that for so many years.
It is, yeah. And like I say, you know, I think the interesting thing is we're starting on a journey of understanding sort of data and analytics and understanding how clubs are trying to kind of process numbers to make themselves more effective. And it's very easy to kind of look back with, you know, and sort of mock and joke the idea, but actually that was the birth of analytics as well, you know. So whereas we can sort of look at it and smile at the birth of the 4-4-2 and it being a very kind of reductive kind of idea, you know, at the same time it was the birth of football analytics and someone sitting down and going, actually what's working and what's not, let's do more of the thing that works. Yeah, but I think like you say, you know, it kind of did become that staple, you know, thinking about the football that I played as a child as well, you know, you never had any shape other than a 4-4-2, you know, and you had that kind of mimic you know, from the football that's on your TV on a Saturday, or if you went down to the ground, you know, all the way through to the park, you know, you mimic those sort of things and you copied those things. And from a very early age, you knew that you had, you know, a big lad and a little lad up top, for example, you know, and as a goalkeeper myself, you know, you aim to fire the ball over the lines to try and get it as much as you could to the big lad up front. So, yeah, I mean, but like I say, you know, I think thinking around the time that it became a little bit unstuck for England was around that time of kind of, I remember the Euros '92, I think it was, you know, Graham Taylor, things starting to become a little bit unstuck, and then gradually, you know, there was the lack of, I mean, not qualifying for USA '94 as well. Yeah. So it forced a rethink and it forced that kind of evolution of tactical shape, and as well as with the Premier League as well, bringing in a whole range of people from outside of the British Isles into the sport. I think it caused an evolution in lots, not just the target man position, but in lots of positions, you know, thinking about the goalkeepers and the pass back rule, thinking about fullbacks who are now auxiliary kind of wingers as well. But particularly the target man, I think we've seen huge changes in that role, and we can probably see that with Kyle Watson, who we're going to look at later on today.
Okay, so we're all familiar with the 4-4-2, but obviously we're talking about how the role of the target man has been evolving over the years. So with that, obviously the formations have got to evolve as well, and we're all used to now seeing many different formations, but there are probably a couple of formations that really lend themselves to the modern day target man, and they're probably 4-3-3 and 4-2-3-1. So I didn't know whether you wanted to just talk us through those at all, and how that's kind of helped clubs to adapt to a more modern and dynamic way of playing, and how it's helped change the way the target man plays as well.
Yeah, definitely. Let's look at one of them now, and then we'll have a chat through it.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what, we'll go for a 4-3-3 because I've done one of those. Look, here you go. So talk us through that then, Colin.
Yeah, well, we talked a little bit last episode about the 4-3-3 because we anticipate it being a shape that Ian Burton was probably going to move towards, and it's one of those shapes that he's quite familiar with. But we talked about the load on that number 9, and I think one of the things that becomes very evident is the amount of space in between the midfield, for example, and that number 9 in terms of receiving the ball. So if you think about the midfield, for example, if they've got the ball, they've got a few options, haven't they? They can either go over the top, which is what you would probably expect with your traditional target man. So you need your number 9 to be really capable in the air. But obviously the danger with that is, particularly in the division that we're playing in, you know, National League teams, that's their bread and butter. You know, they're very much prepared and drilled for that kind of aerial dominance, that aerial battle. You know, the amount of teams that we've come up against and played a back four that looks closer to a rugby lineup or a basketball lineup than it does to a football team. So you start to have to think, okay, well, if we're not going to get much change out of that, we need to start using this target man, this number 9 role, in a slightly different way. And so that's when we start to need other qualities and other criteria. So, for example, again, if I'm either number 8 or number 10 and I'm sending the ball in, maybe I'm playing it to feet. Now, again, I'm not going to name and shame them, but there's been plenty of target men that Notts have had on previous seasons who you would trust them if the ball was at shoulder height to head height, but anything below the waist was a little bit of a lottery, to be honest, particularly as well when you brought up the pitches and all those sort of things as well. You know, of yesteryear. Well, obviously we still have some of those issues in the National League. But so, like I say, you need to be making sure that you've got a number 9 who is capable on the ball and retaining the ball as well. Because if you think about the fact that they're playing probably with their back to goal, you can see that with the back arrow as well. They're receiving the ball into feet. They've got to be able to kind of maintain possession. So they've got to have that good first touch. They've got to also have that strength to keep off that back line. And then also it's about ball progression. So what do they do with the ball from there? Because it's great if they can receive the ball and have it in that particular position, but we're quite far away from goal there. You know, if you think about where that number 9 is currently on the edge of the 18-yard line.
Yeah.
So we need to be looking for those kind of threaded balls through either to 11 or to 7, as you see in the picture. So again, you're starting to look at qualities that are far and above and beyond your traditional target man who's simply with the case of winning it in the air, winning flick-ons, winning headers. Because again, the preparation that defenses go into for that, particularly at our level, and particularly in the British game, that, like I say, that's their bread and butter. So you're going to be needing to do that as well. I think also looking at that back arrow with the number 9 as well, you know, how deep you might have to go in to get the ball. You're almost becoming that kind of auxiliary midfielder yourself. And it's also picking your time then. So if you win the ball deep, if you lay that ball off, you've got to have something in the tank to get back into that box, to get into there to try and finish. So you're also probably looking at someone with either quite substantial acceleration, so being able to kind of move from that kind of middle area of the pitch into the penalty area, or certainly someone who's got a lot of stamina who can be doing a lot of that movement all game.
I think you know, we can sort of look back on this last season, watching Notts, for example, and you know, the 4-3-3, when we've played it, we really have struggled to be an attacking force. And that could be for a number of reasons, I suppose, because you've made some very valid points there, that if you're going to be effective with this, you've got to be good on the floor with the ball. And I think we've struggled at times, certainly if you think of Carl Wootton, and you mentioned, and I think it's something that we'll probably touch on in a little while, but talking about him having to come deeper to probably get more involved to help to create chances, but it's probably taking him away from where he wants to be as a striker, as a number 9. He wants to be the one that's on he's the last man or the first man there. He's the one that's wanting to be back to goal, but able to turn and shoot, or lay it out wide, turn, receive the ball back across from the winger, touch it in or whatever. But if it's coming back too deep, like you say, all that's going to happen is and if you're talking about some of the teams that we've faced this season in particular, the number of times we've watched ourselves up against 2 banks of 4, basically just blocking us at every opportunity. You can see how it must have got very frustrating for Kyle at times as well. So I suppose then we have a look at where we have had some success this season, and we mentioned the 4-2-3-1. Yeah. So we'll just flick over to the 4-2-3-1 here. So if you want to just talk us through that as well, Colin, that'd be great.
Yeah. Well, straight away you've got somebody in kind of close proximity with the target man, which is the number 10. And interestingly, we have had some local newspaper sort of conversations around kind of Kyle Wootton and his relationship with Ruben Rodriguez, not necessarily just on the pitch, but also off it as well, that they get on well together and stuff. And I think we're starting to see that blossom. So straight away, that gap that the target man is having to cover and having to kind of track back with, it's less space. So you can actually stay a little bit more central. You can stay a little bit more offensive as well. You're still going to need that skill set. So obviously, if you are receiving those short passes, you will still need to be capable on the ball, having a really good first touch, having that kind of upper body strength to prevent yourself from being knocked off the ball with your back to the defense. But you're operating in a slightly smaller space. Yeah. But it's also about kind of like having that awareness of where the gaps are, finding those little gaps and those holes, because it could be anybody from the number 10, the number 11, the number 7, who's looking for those kind of angled balls in, and you need to be either getting in front of their back line, or maybe you need to be on the shoulder ready to go past them, looking for that through ball to get one with the keeper.
It's interesting now looking at that, having just discussed the 4-3-3. I think where we did have some success with that was probably last season, when we had both a fit Cal Roberts and we had Wes Thomas as well. And I think that's when that 4-3-3 with Carl playing in a slightly more advanced role as a target man actually did work for us a lot better. And I think what's happened is, because we haven't had both of those players for the main part of this season, we've had a lot of round pegs in square holes, and we all had our frustrations as well through the season of Ruben, when he did get on, was mainly being chucked out on the left, or he was taking it in turns with Sam to go out on the left, and we never really played with a proper number 10. And it's almost as if we need to give Ian Birchnell some credit for this, in that he's identified with Ruben Rodriguez that's a hole that he can fill and make us a lot more effective. And it's not worked every time. I mean, Bromley have shown us how a hard tackling, big 4-4-2 type team can really sort of scupper that. But on the whole, when it's been working really well. And it's actually been down to a lack of efficient finishing more than anything, that we probably haven't won more games. But yeah, I'm just looking at that now, and it was just a thought that came to mind.
I completely agree with you. I completely agree. And like I say, I think the load on the number 9, and I think this is an interesting thing as well that I wanted to come on to anyway, but it's very easy to kind of put the pressure and the onus on a particular player, so a target man, and judging them for a skill set that you think they should be able to carry off, when actually it's a combination of how are they receiving the ball, are they getting the ball in the way that they want to, or that maximizes their potential. So a player that got a rough deal from me as well, I'll be honest, at sometimes, simply because I knew what he could do, was someone like John Stead, who had the physical capability, as in he looked like a target man. He was a big, 6 foot plus lad, but I don't think his skill set was actually in the air very much. And I think it's, not unfortunate he played very direct to his head sometimes. So it was very interesting when he was up with Shola, for example. Shola Amiobi was actually the traditional target man as the one who won it in the air.
Yeah.
Whereas John Stead would be doing the things that we're seeing Kyle do now, which is going deeper, keeping the ball going, flicking the ball on and stuff. But if the other players aren't contributing, it can make the target man actually look less efficient. So for example, if John Stead was playing target man by himself, was doing those things that we're recognizing Kyle's doing in terms of tracking back into the midfield to give the ball. The thing we know about John Stead, and the thing that I'm sure John Stead would have been honest about himself as well at the time, he didn't have that in his tank simply because of the age that he was, to use his acceleration then to suddenly bomb on and get back into the box. So really it was the wide players that were letting him down somewhat, because he was creating that space, and you expect your wider players to tuck in and to become kind of auxiliary centre forwards. They weren't doing it, but it made it look like John Stead wasn't quite doing his role. Because he was going in and he was getting deeper and deeper into midfield, but just didn't have the legs to get forward. And of course, you wouldn't, in the cold light of day, you wouldn't have expected him to. But I'll hold my hands up as well that I found him at the time frustrating, because again, you come at it from a very traditional target man perspective, and at the time, live in the games, when all the passion's going or whatever, you want him to be able to, despite the reality of what's in the tank, you want him to accelerate sort of 20, 30 yards and get on the end of a cross that he's on a play that he's already set up.
No, absolutely. And it's almost like it's something that's continuously coming back to haunt us, isn't it, over recent years? When you talk about John Stead and obviously the struggles that we've seen Kyle have as well. And I'm sure that, I suppose we've not really seen, I love when Shola was playing for us. I absolutely loved him. I thought he was fantastic, and I was so pleased to be able to see a season of Notts, with Shola Amiobi in a Notts shirt. How that happens, I don't know, but it was. But you could see the quality, the difference in quality was chalk and cheese. So, we've kind of looked at the formations there, and if we look at modern day players now, there's still one or two of those traditional target men around. I think we've had a chat about this, and an obvious one. If you're looking at Premier League, Championship, or whatever, you're going to look at Andy Carroll.
He's go on, mate.
No, I was just going to say he's still what you would call a very traditional target man. He can play on the floor. He's still got that in his locker as well. But that 9 times out of 10, if you're lumping a ball up to him or banging a crossover to the far post, that he's going to be the one that's going to get his head on the end of it, in that traditional way.
Yeah, and it's the point I was going to make was it's quite interesting to bring his name up as well, because we're talking also about clubs using analytics and data, and it was Kamoli, I think, who was the director of football at Liverpool at the time, or technical director or head of recruitment or whatever role that he had. But he'd identified that he wanted to demonstrate or to dominate teams aerially. So he wanted to have Andy Carroll in there because of that aerial dominance. And I think that's quite an interesting sort of discussion to have as well, is that, again, it goes all the way back to Charles Reap and talking about those kind of early days of the analytics that Andy Carroll was brought in for that particular, because it didn't seem like a typically Liverpool transfer, if you know what I mean. So it was interesting that it was analytics that informed the recruitment of him for that, even though, as we know, it didn't work all that well.
Absolutely. And also more recently, if we think about that, as from a Notts point of view, we were talking about this beforehand, and you mentioned a certain Vidane Oliver. Yeah. Well,
like I say, Vidane, I liked him at Notts, but like I say, again, probably from a sense of my own kind of football viewing as well, you know, that he didn't seem like he was scoring an awful lot of goals. So therefore, you know, you weren't too disappointed to see him leave. But actually, it also was around the time of the more availability of data as well. So after he left us, you know, he was a name that I kept an eye on a little bit, simply because I liked his mobility. I thought he did the target man stuff well. Yes, all right, he wasn't necessarily a fantastic goal scorer for us, but he did the target man stuff well. And that continued after he left us, you know, and we started to get this data coming out about him winning aerial duels and him being one of the most dominant players in aerial duels in the Football League, you know. So that's that. I've sort of continually kept my eye on him, and he's had a fantastic season this season in terms of scoring. I think it was 17 goals this season for Gillingham. So I think that also proves as well, and it goes back to our earlier point, that, you know, it's very important for clubs to obviously identify the target man that they want, but then to make sure that they're playing a formation and that make sure that they are applying a structure that brings out their skill set, because not every target man is, you know, they're not made in factories, are they? You know, they've got their own particular skill sets. And I think with Vidane Oliver, particularly this season, they've obviously played to his strength, you know, and they've used that aerial duel capability as well as the other stuff that he's got to really good effect. And I think, like I say, you know, our hope is that with Ian Birchall, I'm not necessarily putting it down to Neil Ardley or whatever for Kyle's lack of goals, but certainly I think Ian Birchall has really put Kyle Wootton under the microscope a little bit to go, how can we get you working more effectively? How can we get the best out of you? And let's hope, obviously, with the situation we're in with the playoffs, that we find even more ways to maximize his potential.
Yeah, I'm just going to touch on something very briefly about Kyle, because we're going to talk about him a bit more later on as well. But I was going through some stuff for Notts County Stats today, and I was looking at the XG ratings for the National League, and I was looking at the tables, you know, which players have scored the highest XG and how many goals have they got. And Kyle Wootton's got the highest XG rating in the National League, which you're thinking, oh, great, yeah, he's at the top of the table. But the worrying thing about it is that when you look at him, where he is in the actual goals scored, he's, you know, down there sort of 5th, 6th, 7th place for goals scored, which then sort of begs the question about how efficient he is in front of goal. And are those chances? A big thing is these do include penalties as well, and he's had 2 penalty misses this season. So, you know, there's a couple of big XG scores there that are going to go against him straight away. But yeah, it's just interesting, and I think I wanted to mention that now, because when we go into it a bit further down the line in a short while, it will be more understanding for the viewer to see where we're coming from with all of this. So they're what we would call traditional target men at the moment. Andy Carroll, Vidane Oliver playing at various levels at the moment still. But when we look at that sort of evolution of the target man, and we're looking at the modern day target man, I suppose there's 1 or 2 players that really stand out. And from, you know, if you're English, obviously Harry Kane is a very good example. And of course, today we've also seen, haven't we, Romelu Lukaku's just been credited with being most valuable player in Serie A over in Italy. And again, you know, another great example of this modern day target man.
And yet 2 very different sort of skill sets as well, 2 different body shapes. So yeah, it's really fascinating that we've got these players who we would all attribute to this kind of target man ideal, and going all the way back to what we were talking with at the start, that you would expect them to be well into the 6 foot pluses. You'd expect them to be dominant in the air, for example. And yet, as we start to actually look at the data that's available, we realise that they play very different games. They play on very different sides of the pitch. You know, they dominate in slightly different ways. So it's very interesting to look at these kind of successful models of target men, but understand that there's lots and lots of different ways to play that role.
Absolutely. Well, we had another viewer, Conor McManus, actually asked us, you know, he mentioned that he'd be interested to see how Kyle Wootton compares, you know, in the current game. And I'm just going to bring up a little chart now. And before I bring it up, it's one that you've all seen before. It's a radar, and on there I've got Kyle Walton, Lukaku and Harry Kane. And it's just to give you an idea of how Kyle sort of looks at the moment compared to what we would say are probably amongst the best in the world at football at the moment as this modern day target man. So yeah, what do you think here, Colin? Looking at this, it's pretty obvious that obviously the smaller blue there is Kyle Walton, and the red is Lukaku, and the green is Harry Kane. Now Lukaku and Kane actually very, very similar in their attributes there, but where they're obviously a lot better, you have a look at things like the dribbles completed, passes completed, goals that they've scored, you know. But where Kyle actually comes into his own, and it might not necessarily be for all the right reasons, but his duels won and his aerial duels won, which I find quite interesting.
Yeah, I think, like I say, first of all, you know, it shows us, even though the product that we're watching at Knots is very enjoyable in terms of the fluidity and stuff, I think the first thing to do is it shows us that there's obviously some way to go in terms of moving that forward further, you know, in terms of style, you know. So you see that with the passes completed, for example. So even though we know that Knots are playing a fantastic brand of football at the moment, that definitely demonstrates that there are many layers above that, where obviously Knots can grow and progress, and Kyle particularly as well in terms of his role that he's doing. But I think that again, it goes back to what we were saying tactically, that there's far more expected and a wider skill set expected of a target man. But like I say, you know, also the aerial duels, you still need to be able to do some of those things. So I think, you know, credit to Kyle Walton for standing out in that particular in that particular sort of category, because again, you know, you can only play with the chances that you've been given. I mean, another
it's the case. Yeah, sorry, Colin.
No, all I was going to say was the assists. That was the only thing that was quite interesting as well. And I think that goes back to something that I was trying to say, that judging a player individually, although it's very important, particularly for recruitment as well, where you've got player A versus player B, I think also the assists remind us that the type of players that Harry Kane and Lukaku are laying the ball off to are obviously going to be very capable in terms of their shooting, etc., etc. So obviously the assist column is going to be much higher for those as well. Yeah,
absolutely. And I was just going to make another point again, just reinforce what you've been saying. You know, with Kyle and the aerial duels won, you know, that's an indication of those games where we've been frustrated, not being able to play a usual game, you know, through the phases, through the lines, on the floor, and there's had to be that lump of a ball up top, you know, and he's had to drop a bit deeper, win those aerial battles to try and just make something or anything out of the opportunities or the lack of opportunities that are coming his way.
Yeah, I agree completely. And it goes back to that word of flexibility, doesn't it? I mean, I'd imagine, you know, Harry Kane and Lukaku particularly, you know, don't often sit down and have to think of particularly a plan B or a plan C, because they expect to be dominant in most of the games that they're playing. Whereas obviously, although that we've got a lot of respect and we believe in Notts' strengths, they have got to find these different ways of unlocking teams. And so it's really pleasing to see that Kyle can do that as well, because again, it is about winning it as well. You know, it's not just, you know, we might go direct, but I can remember plenty of target men where we've gone direct and they've seemed ineffective, shall we say, in that kind of aerial duel. So fair play to doing that.
Yeah. Just to compare again, we've got another one here. We've got our old favourite, the heat maps here. So here we go. Here's the 3 heat maps, and again, the one thing that jumps out to me straight away when you look at Kyle Walton's there compared to Kane and Lukaku is the amount of ground that he's had to cover deeper and out wide just to try and get any kind of a sniff of the ball. I think, you know, it's probably indicative of some of the challenges that we've faced in this league when we've been trying to play the sort of football that we want to be playing and not being allowed to.
I think also it gives us some context for the XG stats that you were talking about previously, because, you know, if you imagine that you're Kyle Wootton, you're covering that sort of ground outside the box. So you've won it, you've laid it off, and then you're going to have to get on your bike to get into the box to get the end of a cross from the left-hand side or the right-hand side. You're exhausted by the time that you're swinging a leg or a head at something in there, you know, which, again, like I say, I doubt very much Harry Kane and Lukaku are quite having to put that shift in. And let's face it, the heat map backs that up as well. So I think if we could, you know, if we're talking about improvements to Kyle Wootton's game, it's really about Knots' shape, making sure that he hasn't got to go quite so far out wide, left and right, making sure that that heat map becomes a little bit more red in the centre, as we see with Lukaku and Kane, because keeping him there and making sure that he spends a little bit more time there is probably going to mean that he's going to be more effective in terms of finishing and having that sort of element in his tank where he has got the energy to fire in that 94th minute winner.
And we have seen in recent games as well, where with Ruben playing in that number 10 role, and the way that we've now got the wing backs really sort of, mainly Calvin Miller, you know, flying down the wings there. I think we'll find that if we were to do this exercise, maybe based on the last half a dozen games or something, I think that heat map of Kyle's will probably look a little bit more like the other two's than his own that we've got here at the moment. And I think we'd see that we would find him spending a bit more time in and around that danger area. So yeah, that's kind of. I'm just looking at the Lukaku one again there, and you know, he's very, very, very intense around that, just in between the sort of penalty spot and all that penalty spot area, isn't he? With the red there, so you can see why he's quite prolific as a striker, and he tends to be spending a lot of time down on the right hand side there as well, and that's obviously down to the other players that he's got playing around him and the formation and the type of style, you know, that they're playing with over there.
Yeah, I think so. I think it can be dominant foot as well, you know, so if you're slightly more dominant on one side, you're probably going to favour that a little bit. I think we saw that in the heat maps when we looked at Michael Doyle, for example, versus Jake Reeves in episode 2, where you're going to see some slight dominance over to one side. But I mean, Lukaku, I think it's 24 goals this season and 11 assists as well. And I think, again, that role in assists is something that needs to be kind of considered as well, because again, it goes back to me perhaps unfairly judging previous target men at Knots, because you just you know, you see them as a striker and you see, right, well, how many goals are you getting? But actually, you know, it's that element of assists. I mean, Harry Kane as well, I think he won the assists award as well as the goal scoring award as well this season. So yeah, again, that evolution of this role is and how crucial this role is becoming in not just goal scoring but creating those chances as well is fascinating. And you know, like I say, it's really pleasing to see that Kyle's got some of those aspects in his game already, but you can also see where improvements can be made. Yeah,
and I hope what we've done there has given people a really good insight into how we've been talking about the target man and how they've developed, and there's still a place for that old traditional lump up top. I mean, again, Bromley, we'll talk about them again. Look at Michael Cheek, you know, top scorer in the league and probably one of the biggest strikers in the league as well. So yeah, I think it just goes to highlight as well that when you get up to the higher echelons of the game, when you're looking at the Premier League and the Serie A's and the Liga and what have you, the whole thing about the target man changes very much with the modern day version. And as you said as well, it's about their physical ability as much as their physical stature, if you like. And there is a requirement to spend a lot more time with the ball at the feet, on the floor, you know, and being part of that sort of tactical play where you're seeing the triangles all of the time and the 1-2 passing and what have you, that we're probably not used to seeing with that traditional 4-4-2. So I don't know if you've got any more that you'd want to talk about regarding Kyle and the target man at all, Colin, or do you think we've kind of covered that for everybody?
I think hopefully we've covered it for everybody. I think, you know, the one thing that we'll probably say about, because it might seem unfair to compare Kyle to two players who we know are absolutely, you know, the top of their game.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to explain that obviously the heat maps and the data that we get is contextual. So we're not sort of comparing him and saying that he's kind of world class. Obviously, as Notts fans, we hope he will become that. But it's just interesting in terms of seeing like for like data, you know, from their relevant context. Yeah.
No, but I think it also highlights the difference between the leagues as you go down or as you go up, you know, and what you'd expect to see from somebody in that role. You know, we know that we've got bigger challenges at this level to be able to play the sort of football that the club, Ian Birchnell and the owners want the club to play. You know, and fair play to them for sticking to the guns and still wanting to do that, and hopefully it continues, because when it's working, it's absolutely wonderful to watch. But again, you know, at this level, being able to do that against 11 lumps on the other side that are doing nothing but everything they can to stop you from playing through their lines, you know, it does highlight there, again, with the heat maps, the amount of work that someone like Kyle is having to do, or has been having to do, to actually get more involved in the game. You know, we've seen games where he's looked like he's never had a shot on goal, but he looks like, you know, he's the most tired player on the pitch, and that's because he's probably worked so hard just to try and get involved, compared to maybe how the likes of Harry Kane and Lukaku and what have you have to, because of the quality of the players that they've got around them, obviously. But yeah, it's great to see as a comparison for sure. So I think, I mean, from a Notts perspective, we always like to have a look at the future as well and any potential targets. I know that we had another suggestion regarding Kabongo Shimanga from Carl Motson, who's obviously currently at Boreham Wood. Any thoughts on Shimanga?
Yeah, he's been decent when I've seen him, and I think he's got that standout stat, hasn't he? He's definitely knows where the net is, and I think, you know, there's an awful lot of talk about him going to a league club next season and stuff. So, you know, I think he's one of those players who has got a lot of buzz around him at the moment, and I don't know whether that might prevent Notts from being able to kind of get involved in terms of a bid for him, because obviously he is so prevalent. I mean, going back to Kyle Wootton, one of the things that you have to say, and credit to Notts for bringing him in, is he wasn't a name that was getting a lot of headlines. You know, he was a successful recruitment in terms of, you know, going down and watching reserve team or under 23 football and those sort of things as well. And I think, or I wonder whether that's the solution. You know, obviously we hope we have Kyle Wootton for next season, although we also accept that with the model that we've got, you know, should anyone consider him to be worthwhile, you know, a transfer, there's a very good chance that he'll move on. And I just wonder whether Notts might be looking at, again, a similar sort of solution in terms of bringing somebody in who's probably a little bit more unfancied or a little bit under the radar, shall we speak?
No, absolutely. And I think when we look back at the interviews recently that Richard Montague's done as well, he's kind of alluded to that as well, hasn't he?
Yeah, he has, yeah.
So, okay, I've just had another thought, actually. Sorry about this. This happens to me sometimes. I'm getting on a bit, and we'll be talking about one thing, and then I'll go back to something else. Just another thought about Kyle Wootton. Obviously, when he came to us on loan from Scunthorpe, you know, a smattering of first team appearances at Scunthorpe, but predominantly playing in the reserves. He'd come through the youth and everything there, and looking at him as a player, he's a big unit. He's a big lad. He's a big physical guy. And when he first came to Notts, there probably was still an element of him playing like that old-fashioned target man. And what we're actually trying to do is change him and make him develop into a more modern day target man. And so that's just another layer of sort of challenge that Carl's probably having to face as well, and the coaches and everything else are having to deal with. Is and not just with Kyle, but with a lot of players, various positions, that they'll probably be so familiar with playing in a particular way, and then now they're being asked to play in another way. And to start getting the results that we've been seeing in such a short space of time is quite promising, but it must be really difficult as well.
I agree completely, and I think it goes down to perhaps another further context about why the owners have gone for this kind of head coach model, because they're recognizing the chances of you bringing in an established player who's going to play a particular role and fulfill all the requirements of that role, particularly in the division we're in, is going to be few and far between. So having a coach who can bring someone in who can maximize the potential that a player has got, who can come up with a system that brings out the best in these players. And like I say, with Kyle, it definitely seems like he's looked at data similar to what we've talked about in terms of the heat map, and really trying to make sure that we keep him as central as possible. And like I say, credit to him. And so whoever Notts bring in, we can certainly we will see that they've got some standout features, but I certainly think that there's going to be an element of coaching and development that's going to bring them on and hopefully take them to the next level. Okay,
so this is where you get to tell Notts again where they need to be looking for future recruitment, Colin. So come on, who are we looking at then? Future targets at Notts County.
Well, one of the things that I've tried to do is, again, I've listened very carefully to the Richard Montague interviews and those sort of things. I've listened to him a few times. And one of the things that he's talked about is, because of the limitations of Brexit, which we've touched upon in previous episodes, and I know that it's been talked about quite a bit anyway, the Notts are having to kind of widen their scope and start to look at some leagues that they may have not necessarily considered. And he named specifically, the under-23 leagues, which obviously I'm sure Notts are active in, but the importance of watching those players and getting information about those players suddenly becomes massive, because your other opportunities outside of the British Isles are limited. So one of the names I want to throw out there is simply a player who I think fits that mold of playing under-23 football, someone who's been out on loan, played National League North football at Darlington, is Tyrone O'Neill. The reason why he strikes me as someone who's going to be quite interesting is because he's come through academy football. From the bits that I've seen, and I think this is where I need to be honest, that, and we've talked about before we recorded this, that the availability of data, particularly on Y-Scout and those sort of things, is pretty hard when you start looking at under-23 football and also National League North football. So I've been limited to kind of seeing snippets on YouTube and those sort of things, and really trying to watch sort of back games and stuff. And I think I went all the way back to sort of 4 years ago. There was some footage of him playing under 18 football. But the thing that stands out to me, first of all, is stature. He's got a really obvious physicality in terms of being that target man. But the thing that I've noticed about him, is particularly when you compare the footage from under 18 to under 23, is he's developed that kind of composure on the ball. In terms of, and like we were talking about, if he was going to be successful in a 4-2-3-1, or if he's going to be successful in a 4-3-3, you need that ability on the ball. You need to be able to kind of lay the ball off, etc. And I think he's one of those players that's kind of become more composed over time. So if you look at the footage of him under 18, he is very sort of leggy, quite thin, quite sort of tall, but is really sort of grown up. And you can see that now with his experiences in the National League North, that he knows how to use his body to protect that ball as well, and he's not frightened to do that. So I think he could be an interesting player from that point. I think a bit of interesting context as well. He's represented by SMI World as well, which is the same agency that Jimmy Knowles is with. Calvin Miller's with, and also we've had a few sort of loanees that have come through that agency as well, which kind of possibly, I'm not saying definitely, but possibly sort of strengthens the chances of being able to bring that on, because obviously these agents, part of their job is to send those videos out there and to really try and drum up support for their players. So it may be the case that there's a scouting report on Ian Bircham's desk with Tyrone O'Neill's sort of name on it. And like I say, I think he fits a lot of those kind of criteria that Richard Montague stated. Not necessarily someone who I would see as someone we can rely upon to get huge numbers of goals. I think he has scored goals in National League North, but he's not necessarily someone who you'd expect to see at the top of the goal scoring chart. So plenty of development there.
Okay.
Someone who's got a bit of potential.
Okay, so parent club at the moment, is it Middlesbrough still?
Middlesbrough, but set for release. So was named in their retained list as someone that they're going to release at the end of this month. So someone who's going to be available.
Okay, so that's Tyrone O'Neill. Any others?
Yeah, so someone who I've done quite a lot of looking at, again, limited amount of available data in terms of the leagues that he's playing in, but someone called Danny Williams, who is at Cardiff City. So Cardiff City own him, but he spent the last 6-7 months out on loan in the Welsh Premier League. Now, before we start talking about the Welsh Premier League, and I can imagine there's a few people kind of going, "Oh, Welsh Premier League." Let's remember Conor Rawlinson came from the Welsh Premier League, believe me, with the footage that I've watched, it's not for the faint-hearted. I'll be honest. There was a few of those games where I've winced at tackles that have gone in and things that have gone in. And I have to say, Danny Williams is, to look at, not someone that you would immediately suggest as being a target man, going back to that traditional kind of stereotype of being 6 foot plus, winning everything in the air. But the one thing I've noticed about this lad, and again, it goes back to some of that skill set that we noticed on the radars that we were talking about with Harry Kane and with Lukaku, although that comes, obviously, I am not suggesting that he's on those levels. But when I've watched Danny Williams, first of all, he scores a lot of goals. That's one of the things that stood out to me, and one of the reasons why I wanted to dig a little bit deeper. So Cardiff City signed him from Haverfordwest County in the Welsh Premier. He'd scored 18 goals, I think, in the Welsh Premier, and they'd signed him, and then they've recently sort of loaned him back. And in his most recent loan spell, he hasn't scored quite as many goals. He has scored goals, but hasn't been quite as prolific. And I think one of the reasons for that is on the games that I've watched him, he's often been deployed either wide right or wide left. But actually, one of the things that I've noticed is he's always gravitated towards the centre and looks far more confident in the centre than he does out. Certainly wide right. Wide left, he's pretty decent. I quite like him out there. He's right-footed, so he tends to sort of cut inside on that left, which I like a lot about him. But the other things that he's got in his locker, apart from the goal scoring, is the games that I've seen him, he has not only that ball retention that you need, so the ball comes to him and he keeps it. And again, in the Welsh Premier League, that is something to be commended, because you've got someone sliding in within about a second at your ankles if you're not careful. The other thing as well,
the thing they play in rugby.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but the ball progression is the other thing as well. So it's not just about having the ball and keeping the ball and passing, but actually he moves the ball on into really effective attacking movement. So I've seen him receive the ball out left in that kind of space outside the 18-yard box, and he chooses some really neat passes to kind of pass the ball forward, either between fullback and centre half or down the line. And that's something that, obviously, if you're going to play that number 9 position and you've got your back to goal, and you receive it, finding that pass off is great, but also finding a ball that moves the attack forward. Not every player's got, and I like that about him. He can get assists as well. So, like I say, he's very confident laying the ball off. But also, like I say, with the games that I've seen, with the footage that I've been able to see, he does get amongst the goals. So he's someone who I think, again, we talked about Kyle Wootton and the need to kind of, we recruited him. We saw some standout qualities in him, but has needed to be coached and developed. Danny Williams is someone who I see as also possessing some of the raw material, but not necessarily being the finished product. And maybe that's somebody who Notts need to be looking at. I think his contract is also up at the end of this season. I've not seen his name mentioned on the retain list, so I don't know whether this has been something that's going to be resolved later on with Cardiff City, or whether they've extended it. Maybe they had an option, for example, so they've taken up that option. I'm not sure, but he's 21 as well. So whereas Tyrone O'Neill's a little bit younger, he's 21, and like I say, I'm going to be following him with quite a lot of interest, regardless. So if he gets released, obviously fantastic. But if they retain him, I think he needs a loan somewhere. He needs to be able to kind of step up and move up from there. League of Wales, and maybe not, or somebody like that needs to be looking at a potential loan move in order to kind of see what he can do and kick him on a little bit further.
Yeah. Is there with Danny, just going back on something you mentioned about the games he's played this season, and he's tended to be utilised sort of wider rather than the more central role. Do you think that's purely because of the team structure that they have where he's been playing? As you know, to fit him in, he's had to play there, because they haven't been able to play him where we would like to see him as that, number 9.
I think that's a fair point. I think they've got quite a natural number 9 who's always kind of looking to be on the shoulder and just moving forwards, progressively. Whereas, I do think Danny Williams has got an awful lot in his locker in terms of, like I say, receiving that ball, dribbling. There was a fantastic bit of play where he received the ball quite deep under a lot of pressure and was able to kind of evade 2, 3, 4 players before laying it off. The sort of thing that obviously as a fan you love to see. And I think maybe because he's got that skill set, they're allowing him to play that little bit deeper, that little bit wider. Because maybe, or certainly from the games that I saw, the lad that they're playing centrally doesn't really have that skill set, I don't think. So if they've got limited options, then I could understand why they've probably used him out wide. But again, he's getting amongst the goals. He is getting in there. And I think this is an interesting point as well for anybody who wants to dig at the free data that is out there and start to identify players. When I looked on Transfer Market, for example, with Danny Williams and tried to find data on him, they said that he was playing essentially as a right winger. But actually, when you watch the games, yes, he does tend to start out there. So one of the games that I watched, he had the first 10 minutes where he was largely a passenger out on the right hand side. But then they switched him out to the left and he came alive. And then he came into the centre and almost played as like a number 10 for a little bit, and then switched across again and again. So I think that also kind of shows the need to, obviously the data is incredibly important, but also to kind of question it and to dig a little bit deeper into to try and have a look at the other free stuff that's out there, like the YouTube videos of matches, in order to kind of contextualize what you're seeing, that kind of that raw data and that basic information that's out there.
Yeah, I get the impression as well then that he's probably not the same in stature as a Kyle Wootton or whatever, but again, something that we haven't touched on in this, when you're looking at target men and the modern day target man, there's somebody yesterday or today who's just gone on a free transfer to Barcelona.
Yeah, exactly.
The certain Mr. Aguero, and he's 5 foot nothing and whatever, but he is a typical modern day target man. So it is interesting to try and draw those parallels between the old traditional style and the modern day. So I've found that really enlightening tonight. Really enjoyed that.
Yeah, thanks, mate. Yeah, like I say, I mean, I think it's been fascinating for me as well to reflect as a fan, in terms of, the grief that I probably caused and shouted at, various different sort of strikers, the big lad up top, because you wanted them to get a goal and you're wondering why they're not doing it and why they're not doing this, that and the other. And it's become more and more apparent that, it's all about the system and making sure that the system plays to the strengths of those individual players. And like I say, with Kyle Wootton, he's doing some fantastic things. And I think hopefully, certainly over the next few games, we're going to use a system that plays those strengths even further.
Excellent. Okay, well, it's been another enlightening, enjoyable, interesting episode, I hope. Hopefully we continue to keep everybody glued to the screen when we're on, and really look forward to some more feedback from the viewers as well, and chuck a few more names into the hat. It's been good.
Yeah, fantastic. Like I say, I'll reiterate that, send us names, keep sending us names either on our own Twitter pages or on the Analyst Bar Twitter page, or in the comments, because hopefully what this episode has demonstrated is that we are listening to that feedback and we are trying to provide episodes and shows that people want to hear and see. So thank you ever so much for your contributions, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Absolutely. And